Shalom. Today I would like to talk about the signs of the times. And I wrote about this in 1994, and I haven't written about the end times, the signs of the times, for 25 years. And I haven't spoken about it either, and I haven't done a video clip about it either. So this is just going back to some old truth, to old teachings. And in preparation for this talk, for this study, I reread my articles of 1994 to see what was still sort of true, what was more true, or to see if there are things which are no longer true, to see how actual the article was then. And I noticed that it is even more true, and that even more things are happening now than I used to know then. I wrote in 1994 in the beginning of this article, though day and hour would not be known, Jesus Christ said that there would be signs for the elect to recognize the end of times, the end time. Below, a number of those signs that show that we are living somewhere in the last 40 years before the return of Christ. Time will tell whether there will be 5, 10 or 20 years until the return. Think of the lesson of the fig tree. And the fig tree, of course, the signs of the fig tree is that the summer is near. And the signs of the times are, of course, that the return of Christ is near. And it's sort of a couple of funny things. I realized we were living in the last 40 years, but I expected Christ not straight away 5, 10 or 20 years. But of course, since 1994, the 20 years were passed in 2014. But still, the 40 years that still that ends in 2034. So it could very well be that Christ is going to return in the coming 10 or 20 years. So I realized that we were living in the end time, but I also realized there was still quite a lot of things that had to happen. So it was, it was in between. So let's see what I wrote here. Well, the points I brought forward are mainly from Matthew 24, and but in Jude there is an important verse about the end time as well, because it says the last time. Jude says, they said to you, the apostles, they said to you, in the last time there will be scoffers following their own ungodly passions. So that's 2 points in one verse. It's scoffers and ungodly passions. And of course that was true in the 90s, but it's even true more this very day and age. There's this incredibly mocking, scoffing and jeering of everything that is orthodox. That's, God, the Bible, Orthodox Christians. They're just mocked, they're just jeered at. And the society has secularized, and the Orthodox Christians, they have become a marginal minority. And the mocking is, but not just the mocking of Christians, but also the scoffing at everything, especially with social media nowadays, the way people communicate, because there's this anonymity. Because of the anonymity, people can say anything, and they do. And people get angry very quickly, and they do. And they just say anything. And if they don't agree, there's lots of people that are in government or in positions of authority, they get death threats. The moment they say something, there's always someone disagreeing, and they get death threats. And that's, of course, something which wasn't possible so much in 1994, because we didn't have internet with all the social media which we have nowadays. Well, maybe there was internet in the United States, but in 1994 we didn't have internet yet, or it was just about coming in the Netherlands. We didn't have the social media net anyway, like Facebook and all those things. They came after 2000. So the scoffers, that's something which has only increased since 1994. There's even and think of evolution. You know, evolution is taught as a fact, and creation is ridiculous. It's regarded as ridiculous, and that's just scoffing at. It's a mockery of God, and it's scoffing at God. So that's one thing of this verse. In the last time, Jude says, and Jude is the brother of Jesus Christ. In the last time there will be scoffers. And it says also in the same verses, following their own ungodly passions. And I wrote about ungodly passions in 1994. Again and again we may notice the sick sexual degeneration of our society. Incest, murder, rape, porn, children porn, debauchery, sexual promiscuity, etc. And this was bad in the 90s, but it hasn't improved. It's only gone, you know, from bad to worse, because this was written before all the abuse scandals that have surfaced in the past 25 years. And this was written 7 years before gay marriage was introduced in the Netherlands, you know, in 2001, and which is now sort of conquered the Western world, the gay marriage. And this was before the whole LGBTQI movement. I have to spell it sort of because I'm used to the expression in Dutch, and then we've got different letters, and the letters, they have been changed in the past 10 years as well, and every time there's a letter added to it, and it's the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning and intersex movement. And they've got all those letters to, and they keep adding to it yet. And what the Bible says about it is very plain. You know, it's in Romans 1. It's in Romans 1 verse 26. It says, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural. Verse 27, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a base mind and to improper conduct. They were filled with all manner of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malignity. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. And verse 32, though they know God's decree that those who do such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but approve those who practice them. They approve those. And now this whole movement started as a movement of acceptance. We want to be accepted as well. And so they were accepted, and that's the first step. They were accepted. And now, but that's not enough. It's not enough. No, it's not enough that it is accepted in society. No, they want the church or Christian schools not just accept them, but in Christian schools we have to teach that what they do and what they teach is not just acceptable, but is okay. Is okay in God's eyes. So we have to change the Bible and say, you know, God made mistakes in the Bible by instituting heterosexuality, and God made a mistake because it's okay. Of course, it's not okay according to the Bible. So, scoffers and ungodly passions. Now, let's go to Matthew 24, to this discourse of the end time. The first thing that Jesus Christ mentions is deception, or leading astray, or misleading. Because he asks, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall the sign of thy coming and of the coming and of the end of the world? Of the end of the world. And end of the world, that means of that age, of the 6,000 years under Satan, you know, and that doesn't mean the destruction of the planet Earth. It means that there will be a new world, and the new world, that's the world tomorrow under Jesus Christ, the 1,000-year reign, the sabbatical reign. that Isaiah talks about and that Revelation 20 talks about. So what's the coming and what is thy coming and the end of the world of Satan, and the beginning of the new world? And Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. There's deception, and of course there's incredible religious deception. There's sort of the churches, they keep splitting and splitting and splitting, and there's more and more choice of what sort of church you can choose. But not just that, there's this, everything with New Age and Eastern religions, because the people, they secularize and they leave the church, but then there is this void, this emptiness in their hearts and in their life. So they start searching for the meaning of life. And of course, the meaning of, they don't go back. You don't know, you know, Protestants don't go back to Protestantism, and Catholics don't go back to Catholicism. They don't go back to a religious, to the first religious upbringing of their parents or grandparents. No, they start searching, you know, Eastern religions, Hinduism and Taoism and Zen Buddhism and I don't know what, and the New Age and celestial signs and whatever. So there's this great leading astray deception. And of course, there's not just religious deception, there's all sorts of leading astray and lies and deception in this world. And the second thing, this deception, that's the white horse. That's the white horse of Revelation 6. And in Revelation 6 you get the white horse and the red horse and the black horse and the pale horse. And actually those four horses, that's what you find back in the first 4 points of this discourse, this end time discourse of Jesus Christ. And then you get the red horse, and the red horse, that's wars. And Jesus talks about that in Matthew 24 verse 6. And he says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Wars and rumors of wars. And it says here, the 20th century was the most murderous in recorded history. The total number of deaths caused by or associated with its wars has been estimated at 187 million. So that's for the 20th century, that's for the last century, 187 million. The equivalent of more than 10% of the world's population in 1913. Anyway, I checked on the internet what the score is now since that time. And since that time, it says here, because there's this Swedish club, there's a Swedish society that keeps tracking of every war and every conflict and every civil war in the world, and keep recording all those things. And they said that since the Second World War, there have been 285 wars, civil wars and conflicts. 285. So that's on the increase as well. You know, it was true in 1994. It's even more true now. In checking about this subject, I found that the question was, what was the most bloodiest conflict since the Second World War? And to my surprise, that's the war in Congo. The war in Congo, with all the deaths that it caused by hunger and by starvation, and the war in the Congo comes to about 5.4 million, and it has not really been, you know, there's lots of, it's like Yemen is a forgotten thing as well, you know, it's not in the forefront of things. It's not been in our in our national interest. And of course the Middle East is our national interest, that's oil. So Afghanistan and Iraq and those things, they have been well reported. But Congo, you know, whenever do you read about Congo? I've got a very, very thick book about Congo that I read a couple of years ago, and it's gruesome. It's gruesome, the history of the Congo, and that war, which ended in 2008, cost about 5.4 million dead. You may never have heard of it, but it did happen not so long ago. The next point that we see in this discourse of Christ is nationalism. It says here in Matthew 24, verse 7a, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." And in other translations it says, "People will rise against people and nation and kingdom against kingdom." In Matthew 24, verse 7a. And nationalism, that's something quite recent in history of the past 200 years. It really started in 1870 when Germany with the unification of Germany and with the unification of Italy. Then all the other nations in the world, they saw that Italians could become one nation that were divided in hundreds of little principalities and counties and provinces or whatever, and Germany the same. There were kings and countesses and princes in Germany, and they were united. They were united in one nation, both the Germans and Italians in 1870. The Italians by Garibaldi, and the Germans, of course, by what's his name? I forgot his name, but he made the King of Prussia the first emperor, Emperor Wilhelm I. And since that time, it has been an aspiration of peoples, especially if people are united by a religion and by a piece of land and by a language. They want to govern themselves. They want to be a different nation, and that didn't used to be like that. You would have the Roman Empire. Of course, you had the Romans, but then apart from the Romans, you had all sorts of peoples within the Roman Empire, and the same with the Hungarian Austrian Empire. There were two dominant peoples: the German speaking people, and the Austrian and the Hungarian-speaking people. They were the dominant forces within an empire, but you had all sorts of peoples living there as well. And then, of course, you have the British Empire. The British Empire, the English and even the British, they were a small minority within their empire. The empire there were lots and lots of peoples and nations within that one empire. And that was more or less the norm until the end of the Second World War. But at the end of the Second World War, there were about 30 or 40 nations, because the big colonizing nations, they hadn't started the decolonization yet, which was about to begin then. Especially in the 50s and the 60s, it went very fast. So we have about 200 nations now, while we had about 40 in 1945. So it is. Yeah, every nation, every people want to become independent, and I just have. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes, like the Southern Sudan has been the latest newcomer, I think, as a new nation, which has been able to fight for their independence in 25 years' time. But of course, sometimes it does not work out, like with the Catalan people. The Catalan people, they voted for independence. Spain doesn't give it to them. Wanting to have your own country and fighting for it is also a sign of the times, because we have 200 nations in the world now in the United Nations. The next point that Christ mentions in his discourse, in his sermon, is the black horse. Of Revelation 6. And he says in Matthew 24, verse 7b, "And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places." Famines. In percentage-wise, the famine has decreased in the past, since I wrote this article in 1994. Famines were worse in the 80s and in the 90s. But I checked this also in Wikipedia. It's still that bad that, say, malnourishment and famine is still that bad that about 1 billion people, we have about 7.5 billion people in the world, 7.5 billion, and 1 billion of them are either malnourished or are starving. So there's quite I forgot the number. I thought it was 7,000 or 8,000 people that starve every day, and even if it is sort of less than it was, even if there has been some improvement in the 80s, since the 80s and since the 90s, it's still quite bad that 1 billion people do not have enough to eat, and quite a few of them die. Then the next verse, then the next thing that Jesus Christ mentions is in Matthew 24, verse 12. He says, "And because there will be more and more lawlessness, most people's love will grow cold." And there is this lawlessness, the law, the 10 commandments, there's 4 commandments towards God and 6 commandments towards men. Love towards God and love towards men. And if you do not believe in the law, then the love of people will grow cold. Now, of course, God does not exist, because we all know it's a world of evolution. We all came here in a big bang and evolution. So if God doesn't exist, we don't have to express our love towards God. So there's this lawlessness in the first 4 commandments, which means you can profane and swear and anything, you can scoff and mock, because God doesn't exist anyway. But it's also the 6 commandments towards men. They grow cold, because people, they don't want to hear. You're not allowed to steal, but it's about the only thing. If you want to commit adultery, it's up to you. You go to a site, Second Love, on the internet, and she keeps her marriage and you keep your marriage, and you go to a hotel and you have Second Love, and children, children from the age of 12 years old and older, they can decide for themselves all sorts of things which their parents will forbid them, but they have the right and the authority to decide for themselves. They are of a certain age to choose for themselves, so they don't have to keep the 5th commandment of love towards. So there's less and less love, and that's because of the lawlessness that we have in this society. Because everything that is God's law in the Bible is voted against, and this, we got euthanasia, we got abortion, we got gay marriage, everything that God forbids, we have in this society, and that's gone a lot worse since the 90s. And then the last thing I want to mention is pestilences, the pandemics, the pale horse. And this is not in the discourse in Matthew 24, because we have this discourse also in Luke 21 and in Mark 13, and not every detail is in every discourse. The longest is in Matthew 24, and Matthew 24 doesn't mention this pale horse, these pestilences. The pestilences are mentioned by Luke. Luke recorded that in Luke 21 verse 11. It says here, "There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven." So Luke mentions the pestilences, and that's the pale horse of Revelation 6. And now, if we just look at 2 things, we have the AIDS virus. So the AIDS virus, that has caused about 40 million dead, close to 40 million dead in 40 years' time. And of course, you can attract that by using dirty needles, infected needles. You can, and of course, through sex, by having sex with a person who has that as well. And those are the main ways of attracting that. And but 36, 40 million dead in 40 years. I had to compare that with COVID-19. If you're not a drug addict, and if you just have sex within marriage, then there's a very small chance of you getting the AIDS virus. Of course, the COVID-19 virus, is a completely different story, because it goes through the air, from your breath, through the airways, from one to the other. and then so it's easily spread within a population. And so the increase in air traffic in the past 25 years has been enormous. People are going all over the world in tourism to see all sorts of lands and places where normally people would not go and hardly anyone would come. And that, of course, has enabled this virus, this COVID-19 virus, to spread all over the earth within no time, with a speed that wouldn't have been possible in 1994. And the amount of, we have now about 5 million people that died in 2 years' time. 5 million people died in 2 years' time. And you can easily add another 1 or 2 million, because there's lots of countries, third world countries, that do not have a good system to register the dead, to register what they died of, where they died and what happened. And they do not have, a central bureau of statistics is not present in every country, or is not very functional in every country. So there's lots of countries where they haven't reported the amount of people that really died. And then you have the authoritarian regimes, like Iran and Turkey and China and Russia. And of course they've got dictators in power there that do not want bad news, and who are able and capable of manipulating the numbers. And so they have, you can, if you look up the numbers of the dead of Russia, you can at least add 50% or maybe double it, because they have underreported immensely. So there's this pestilences. So these are quite a few signs of the times that I wrote about in 1994, and I want to go on about this another time. And with all of them, it has increased. So it's even more of the end time. It has increased, and it has gone worse. It hasn't become more peaceful. And the article was true about the signs of the times in 1994, and it's even more true now. And the bad thing is that all these terrible things, they happen now, and that's bad news. The good news is the coming of Christ is soon, and he will usher in a new world, a peaceful world. Amen.